I'd now like to call to the stage Professor Mika Makela. He's a paediatric allergist and chairman of the Skin and Allergy Hospital at the Helsinki University Central Hospital. He's done research on airways since 1985, focusing first on immune responses to respiratory viruses, and since the 90s, the main focus on asthma and allergy. Welcome, Makela.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. And of course, the biggest thanks goes to Peter for inviting me here, and I'm really happy to be first time in my life in Brisbane. Thanks also go, of course, for Mark Brook and Terry Evans for making this possible. And I must say I'm enjoying the weather and the scenery here so far. I must say also that in contrast to the rumors, we don't have problems with traffic jams with polar bears in Helsinki. So we are not quite that bad anyway, although we are in slightly cooler conditions than you guys are. But anyway, I'm going to talk more tomorrow about the Finnish asthma and allergy programs, which I think is more relevant for this conference, connecting asthma patients and us with them. And I think Peter wanted to get out of me a bit more, also giving the title for this, the Hygiene Hypothesis, for this other lecture, which we are also doing some research on, and this is why, of course, I like to talk about this subject. So let's go and see what the Hygiene Hypothesis really means. Okay, where do I point? Okay, there are my disclosures. And then, yeah. So we are going to discuss a bit about what is the origin of allergy in a way. Exactly what Janet was just in the previous presentation talking about allergic rhinitis being the most obvious manifestation of allergy. And it's very much going together with, of course, with the asthma, as we well know. The hygiene hypothesis, what does it mean? If I don't know something, I go to Wikipedia, and I think many of you go and do that. So if you check what Wikipedia says, the original formulation of the hygiene hypothesis dates from 1989, when Strachan proposed that lower incidence of infection in early childhood could be an explanation for the rapid 20th century rise in allergic diseases such as asthma and hay fever. This is pretty well said, and it actually says the thing that is common right now in our scientific community, saying that this Strachan paper would be the origin. And this is the paper, which is hay fever, hygiene, and household size. But what it really only shows is that the fourth child of a family has about 50% smaller risk for allergic rhinitis than the first child of the family. Everything else is speculation. So actually, David Strachan wrote that over the past century, declining family size, improvements in household amenities, and higher standards of personal cleanliness have reduced the opportunity for cross-infection in young families. This may have resulted in more widespread clinical expression of atopic disease emerging earlier in wealthier people, as seems to have occurred for hay fever. But what does it then really mean? There could be a zillion different explanations for this finding. Not to talk about immunology, what's happening with the mother, with the aging of the mother, and so on. So he didn't prove anything in that paper. Neither was actually the thought of infections and hay fever having something to do with each other a very novel one. Actually, Canadian researchers, I have never met Gerard or Horn, but they did a study in 1976, actually in 819 individuals in 176 white families and 275 individuals in Métis Indian families living in northern Saskatchewan. And they found that there's a difference in the total IgE levels and in the clinical manifestation of allergic diseases. And what they say as their conclusion, it is suggested that atopic disease is the price paid by some members of the white community for their relative freedom from diseases due to viruses, bacteria, and helminths. I think this is actually 13 years before said pretty much the same thing, but even with more clear words. Hygiene hypothesis was first time in an article 1988, and it had nothing to do with allergies. So altogether, I think hygiene hypothesis is a misnomer, but it has led us to a good research question which is being hopefully answered in the next decades or so. The original Strachan paper led us to think of single diseases in childhood, such as measles. We were quarreling about, I did my PhD on measles, and there were pros and cons. Is measles protective for allergies, or is it actually causing allergies? And there were studies in the 90s, pro and con. There was hepatitis A, there was Helicobacter pylori, and so on. A lot of single diseases which really led us to do, I think, for a decade of nonsense studies, which really didn't help us in explaining anything. Excuse me being a bit critical here. But then finally, I think what really was a cornerstone study was the Erika von Mutius study, a group of studies actually from Switzerland and from Austria, where they showed that exposure to farming in early life actually has a huge protective factor. If you look at atopic sensitization in children who have lived in a farm and they have gone to the stables in their first year of life and also got farm milk during the first year of life, their OR for atopic sensitization would be 0.32. This is something that big pharma companies dream of, getting some medication which would have OR like this. Even for a vaccine, this would be decent. So there must be something in the farming environment, and this has been repeated in a number of studies, also one of them coming from Finland and so on, and from many, many places. So I think this is true. But what is the explaining factor? This is something we don't quite know yet. But anyway, this has led us to think of the bacteria that are surrounding us, and what has happened with the bacteria that are colonizing us during the last decades. It has also led us to understand innate immunity versus adaptive immunity. And adaptive immunity, for those who are not familiar with immunology, it means the specific T cells, B cells, which are recognizing the particular antigen or allergens. Whereas innate immunity is more like stuff happening on our mucosal membranes. If a bacteria or virus comes on our membrane, we get interferon responses. There's things happening with the toll-like receptors. They are recognizing more like patterns of molecules, not specifically a sequence like the adaptive immunity. And there's a crosstalk between these two, and there's a very much crosstalk between commensal bacteria and both the innate immunity and adaptive immunity, which regulate our immune responses. Microbiome term was introduced by Joshua Lederberg, who actually won even a Nobel Prize for his discoveries about genetic recombination of bacteria. And he created this term that actually microbiome means the ecological community of commensal and pathogenic microorganisms which reside in our body, in the gut or skin or wherever. So we can think that our body is actually an ecosystem, and being in a subtropical place like Brisbane, you can easily think like a rainforest, which seems pretty distant to us in Finland. But anyway, like in rainforest, it's an ecosystem of microbes that constitute a newly discovered organ as itself, which is called the microbiome. How big is this organ? Some people say that it's about 1.4 kilograms of bacteria that are in our gut. Human microbiome project was started by NIH a few years ago, and the idea there is actually to describe all the commensal microbes which are typical for our nose or our mouth or skin. And originally it was a cohort of 300 individuals. And now actually, based on the first few published studies, this one being, I think, number 1 or 2 of that project, which shows that microbial carriage, for example, varies between subjects down to the species and strain level. But then there's also the variation between the sites we are taking the samples of. Our bacteria in our armpit or mouth are completely different. But then there's also the variation between different human beings. But if you take a sample from mouth and from another guy's mouth, they tend to be, as a pattern, fairly similar. What we used to think was that the skin has the surface which has a huge number of bacteria, and that still holds the truth. What we didn't know before these projects was that actually microbiome extends to the deeper compartments of normal skin. So that it has been shown actually that, not going in more deep details, that the bacteria are even in the very deepest layers of skin, although there's a much smaller number, but there are several different species going below something what we can see actually with our own eyes. There seems to be a connection with what's happening globally is loss of biodiversity at macro level and also at microorganism level. And Tari Hahtala, who is well known to our scientific community and who was predecessor of mine, he's retired now for a couple of years, but he's still active in many ways in research and so on. So Tari has been writing a lot about this trend hypothesis. So that at the same time, we know that a number of chronic inflammatory diseases have been on rise, and this data coming from Finland, for example. If you look at prevalence of asthma and allergic rhinitis, it's obvious that they have been increasing for several decades now. But so have type 1 diabetes, so have inflammatory bowel diseases, things like Wegener's granulomatosis and so on. So what is common to all of this is that there's something going wrong with the immune system producing chronic inflammatory disease. We have been looking at, in a way, field conditions which are completely different on two sides of a border between two countries, that is Finland and Russia. On Finnish side, there's if you look at the gross national product per person, it's huge compared to the one which is on the Russian side in Karelia, which is very poor area of Soviet Union. I mean, Soviet Union has been, or Russia these days, has been improving tremendously in their standard of living and average guys living standards. But the Lake Karelia area, where we have been doing this study, has remained poor. So there's a huge gradient in standard of living and also in allergies. So if you look at the Russian side data, if you think of the bird sensitization on the top corner there, this is Finnish people born in different decades, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. So every new generation is more sensitized than the previous one, meaning that the children of ours will be more sensitized than we are, and so on. But this is not happening on the Russian side. Actually, it still stays the same. So if 45% of 10-year-old children on Finnish side are sensitized to one specific allergen that we are looking at, the same number on Russian side is 15. This is the world's biggest allergy gradient. We have been trying to make sense of this, what's happening. And here we come to the biodiversity trend hypothesis, so to say. World Wildlife Foundation has published these figures showing living planet index. We are going down very rapidly with our biodiversity if you look at the number of animal species at macro or micro level. At the same time, we're seeing this huge increase in these diseases, like I showed you earlier. Actually, you can also link the Living Planet Index and World Bank country income groups, so that actually this diversity loss seems to go together. Wherever there is more money, there's less life in a way. Sad. So biodiversity variety may be linked, and this is linked then to the bacterial species, what we think could be the reason for the whole thing. The striking contrast, if you look at the asthma, for example, on Finnish side and on the Russian side, is fivefold. If you look at the hay fever, it's even bigger one. And as you see, the adults, this is the latest data that we have been doing now, have been still keeping this huge difference between the two countries. The same goes for type 1 diabetes. So it's not only asthma and allergies which are to blame here. We tried to measure, for example, the bacteria in their drinking water. We know that the Russians have typically wells, which are just surface water wells, so there are a lot of bacteria there. And actually, we showed that there's a huge difference. Although these are mainly dead bacteria, but there's dramatic difference between the Russian water and Finnish water. Perhaps being one explanation why there's a diversity difference. If we take just normal dust from houses, there's a big difference in the amount of bacterial DNA. Again, Russians having much more of that than we do in our Finnish homes. The barn dust, we have also compared, if you take a barn dust or you take a home dust, these samples are completely different in the bacteria what are included in the dust. So if there are more microbes and different microbes, then what is the connection then? What are they doing? We did a few years ago this study where we were looking on the Finnish side in Joensuu area. We were collecting samples from the children, or adolescent actually in this case, and we would take their skin microbiome, looking at the bacterial species, what they have on their skin, looking at what is the surrounding where the families live. Dividing with ecologists, Ilkka Hanski is one of the world's best-known ecologists, and he has won even the Crawford Prize, which is not Nobel Prize, because when Alfred Nobel was alive, there was no such thing than ecology. But they have actually made this Crawford Prize afterwards, and it's actually handled by the Swedish Royal Academy. So it's something equal in a way, the Nobel Prize, and Ilkka Hanski won it a few years ago. So he's very good with these ecological studies, and he did with his research group landscaping analysis. So is there wood, is there waterlands, is it wasteland, is it forest, whatever is there. And we connected that with atopy. So what we found was actually that in the land use types around the families, it was connected to skin microbiota, and it was connected again with immunology, which was connected to atopy. So we are not saying that this is a causality, but at least we are showing that there's a connection between these things. Gamma proteobacteria, which are present in abundance in our body, seem to be important in this interplay. And we have been doing very complex bioinformatics system biological approach, comparing how exactly these different bacterial species are involved with our immune system and have shown some association even at the cytokine level. We have also, I just passed that because of the time, also looked at the microbiome on the skin of these patients, both on the Finnish side and the Russian side, and this is the number of different genera which are in large numbers, and you see the huge difference between the Russian and Finnish side. So we have much less different bacteria on our skin than the Russians have. So it seems to be that there is this idea that these bacteria play with our immune system, and this crosstalk may be the reason why we are developing our immune system towards allergic type of response. So putting together the biodiversity hypothesis means that the clinical symptoms and diseases under that would be the inflammatory dysresponse, which would be then a response to immune dysfunction, which is because of the poor microbiome or dysbiosis. And we pass now. So measurement of abundance of bacterial DNA in sub-epidemiological compartments I talked about earlier, we haven't done that. But if you would assume that these big differences on the surface of the skin also goes deeper on the compartments of our skin, it may be explanatory factor why this crossplay between environmental DNA, barrier microbiome DNA, and human cell DNA are all linked to each other and making us more allergic, more asthmatic, more with diabetes, and so on. I will just skip the rest of the point and going directly what I also like always doing, taking a mirror in my hand and looking at, am I really serious? Are we sure that all that we are saying is true? And I think there was an excellent paper in Nature just recently which says microbiome science needs a healthy dose of skepticism. Because right now what is happening also in the scientific world is that we are all running to the same direction, and oftentimes what happens is that we are facing the wall at the same time and boom, and then we go running again the other direction. So we still need much more data to show that this is all causal and so on, and I'm not saying that. You have your superstar of allergy research, Susan Prescott in Perth, who has put very similar thoughts together and has also published a lot of data supporting that this may be true, but as I said, we are still on the wait for the final answers. Finally, showing that this is the group we are working on this project with Tari Hahtila being still chairing this group. There's a number of people, ecologists, biochemists, allergists, and so on, and we are continuing these studies, and hopefully in the future we can get some more definitive data on this. Thank you very much.
Mika, we have 5 minutes for questions, so if you've got a question, please raise your hand, and Annika will bring the microphone around to you.
I don't know if I need it. Huva Pava, Professor. Slightly left field question. Australia is being overwhelmed by cleaning companies selling us antibacterial rubs and cloths and wipes. Is this adversely affecting our children's growth in terms of being able to fight bacteria by being too clean?
Personally, I think that that's not any more important. I mean, I think the big changes in the microbiome happened with the sewering system, with the clean water systems, and with fridges. So those were long before these hygiene, extra hygienic things like you were talking about, the sprays and so on, came on the market. So I don't think we are actually, with this poor microbiome we already have, doing anything more bad. Tari Hahtila has been saying in many of his talks that yes, we should expose the children more to dirt and so on, but there's actually absolutely no proof that we could do some good with this. I mean, maybe what we have now is just city dirt, which is no good anyway. So why on purpose start trying to do something that we have absolutely no idea whether it would work? I don't think personally that it would work. It's hard to go back in time 50, to 60 years.
Mika, do you think that some of the need for this biodiversity is because within that biodiversity there are some protective or helpful bugs that are putting metabolites into our system that modulate our immunity?
Yeah. Yes, I do. I think there's, and I didn't have time to go into probiotics and all that, but there's pretty much evidence that bifidobacteria and lactobacilli, for example, are really doing the job. And I mean, we obviously have lost majority of those probiotic bacteria residing in our gut. So there's proof to some extent that by supplying extra certain probiotic bacteria that you can make a biological difference, which I find fascinating that you can do some effect. If you think that you have 10 to 13 bacteria in your gut, and just by putting 10 to 8, 10 to 9 bacteria of one strain, that you could actually induce a biological response, like many studies have shown.
Could you go straight and just give them, you know, the short chain fatty acid metabolite and skip the bug?
People have tried doing that, and just by modifying the fatty acid chains, the effect is not big enough. I don't think it's easy to get that. But of course, somebody's talking about companies. I think companies are desperate to look for the serial addition what you have. There was this paper published 15 years ago where they had a new type of cornflakes added with CpG sequences and so on. So we would love to have some additional thing which would be just a part of the bug which would do the job. And of course everybody is running towards that, but so far with no success.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mika.